Hello everyone, this is our first video we're going to be looking at in building our ideas around lesson planning. This first video you can see there is around introductions and foundations. We're going to be just doing the basic work. We're not going to get into the actual nuts and bolts around lesson planning just quite yet. We're just going to do some sort of foundational work, and then for the next video we'll start the actual process around writing objectives and thinking about lesson planning, and really as an extension from that, unit planning a little bit as well. So this is going to be just a first introduction. I think it's important though, to start at the beginning, start at definitions, start at basic terms, and that way we all have sort of a common baseline of definitions and terminology that's important in the work we're going to be doing moving forward. So let's begin. So our overview here, three things I would like to try to get done within this video, the first of which being just the terminology. Um, it's really easy in classes like this for us to be using terms that we've used so often that we kind of get a little detached from the definition or our definitions of what the terms mean. And so sometimes that can lead to a lot of people using the same words, but using them to mean different things and using them differently. And so it becomes difficult to communicate when that's the case. So like try to establish some sort of like baseline idea of like what these terms mean. And of course, we can discuss these definitions a little bit more in class if there's any confusion or any difficulty or argument around what any of these terms mean. But that's going to be the first thing, just starting with the terminology. The second thing will be a very brief discussion about motivating why we need to plan at all. I'm going to imagine that most of you understand like this is a thing that you have to do, which is why you're taking a class like this. But I really want to get into sort of like the layers of why that's the case, something beyond a little bit more, than I'm being told to do it. So we'll talk about the many different aspects of why planning is good and important. And then the last thing is a framework for how to start thinking about lesson planning. Um, there's a bunch of different frameworks we can use, but there's one specifically that I like to use for this class that I've found to be successful and useful. So we'll introduce that framework a little bit and some other pieces that kind of go along with it, and then we'll delve into that a lot more deeply when we get into the next video and the next few videos when we start really getting into the practice of lesson planning. So that's what I'm hoping to get done with this first video. So I kind of want to start at the beginning, and this is our three main ologies, as I call them here. So we have pedagogy, um, epistemology, and ontology, or pedagogy, as some people would say. So pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. It's the way we just think about our teaching. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as the art and science of teaching, which is kind of nice because the science feels like it's a little bit more the rigorous piece, and the art feels like it's a little bit more of the subjective personal piece. So I kind of like that definition, that the balance there of seeing teaching as being both um, a science and an art. So however you want to think about it, when we talk about pedagogy, we're mainly talking about thinking about our teaching. Now I want to kind of put that next to these other two, the second here being epistemology, and that's the study and theory of knowledge. It's important if we're going to teach that we have some sort of idea of what it means to know something. Uh, you will hear often pedagogy also including like the science of teaching and learning, and sometimes learning kind of gets lumped in with epistemology. The knowledge is also sort of like combined in with like how we acquire, how we gain that knowledge. But mostly you will see epistemology as just the how we think about knowledge. So how is it that we come to know things? And as is important as a growing concern in our society, how do we distinguish knowledge from opinion? How do we understand the nature of facts? Um, so in order for me to be an effective teacher, I feel like I really also need to understand what is it to know something. I mean, if that's how I think about at least a large part of my job, I want people to leave my class knowing something that they didn't know when they came in. Well, what does that mean to know something? If I can do something without understanding it, how well do I know it? Or if I can understand the theory behind something, but I can't practically do that thing, do I know that thing? So, I mean, these are big questions. We won't wrestle with them too much in this class, but I want you to be thinking about them going forward because it should help, and it should kind of contextualize your teaching. Um, so we'll talk about it a little bit. We'll be thinking about it a little bit, but it certainly won't be a main focus of the class. And then the last one, sort of above all of that, is this idea of ontology, the study of the nature of truth, which is a much larger question. If I know something and I acquire it as knowledge, and it's factually untrue, how do I determine? So here we have this debate that we hear a lot in education courses between objectivism and constructivism, and I'll be totally honest, it's so difficult to define these two terms without using the word somehow in the definition. As much as I want to say objectivism is that we view knowledge as being objective, and that constructivism is that we construct our knowledge, we try not to use the word in the definition as natural as that seems. So. Um, we can say that objectivism is that we view knowledge and ideas as being fixed and free from personal experience. Um, that knowledge is there no matter what. No matter how I come to understand that 2 plus 2 is 4, factually, that 2 plus 2 is always going to be 4. That is an idea that existed before me, will exist after me, so on, so on, so on. So there's that school of thought. And then I've included sort of behaviorism underneath that as sort of like an extension of that, this idea that we can learn things simply by having our behavior controlled. That becomes very objective because that shows that like our human nature is independent of everything else. If I, if you, people think about the Skinner box or the Pavlovian dog, uh, the dog's salivation being linked to the bell, by operant conditioning, the dog's not making a decision about that. The dog's not making a choice. It's relatively free of the dog's will. So that's sort of an extension of that we hear about and talk about of behaviorism. The other school we have is constructivism, and this idea that we form knowledge through our own experiences. Um, And so sometimes people will talk about knowledge as being personal, um, but we still may hold a piece of knowledge that's not necessarily personal, but the acquisition of that knowledge is. So there's varying levels to this. And then I've also included here by extension this idea of social constructivism that really focuses on the construction of knowledge or the formation of knowledge, not to use the word in the definition again, the formation of knowledge through our social interactions. That I can do more within a group of people collaborating than I can sort of independently. So we will discuss this a lot more in class. I'm sure you've had this discussion a bunch of times. Again, this is not a problem to be answered necessarily, but we'll talk about this, and I want you to be thinking about what can be learned from both sides of this debate. Um, yes. So, like I said, we'll talk about more in this class. I'm trying not to give the classroom discussion away too much, but yes, we'll talk about this more in class. So another dichotomy that I wanted to look at is this idea around curriculum, and people use the word curriculum as sort of a single monolithic thing, and it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and especially in regards to what we're going to be doing in this class. So we have this idea of formal curriculum, which is like external decisions that are made regarding what we're going to have to teach. The state decides that these are the standards, substandards, benchmarks that we have to hit as teachers, or your professional organization decides these are ideas that are important or teaching practices that are important. It may be a textbook that your district gives you and says, this is what you got to teach from this year. These are decisions that are largely external. These are things we can't change, can't do an awful lot about. They are sort of given to us. Now, compare this to enacted curriculum. Enacted curriculum is the means by which you do that thing. So even if I'm given a textbook and told I have to teach from this book, that does not necessarily dictate the way I'm going to teach with that book. I may not have a whole lot of choice around the text, but I have an awful lot of choice around the way that I use that text to what I think is its best usage. So you can sort of think about these two things, the dividing line between them being your level of autonomy. You may not have a whole lot of autonomy around the formal curriculum. Of course, you can always try to take on more autonomy by being part of your textbook selection process within your district, or doing work with the state in terms of helping frame and guideline standards. But that's largely work done outside your classroom. Um, Within the classroom, formal curriculum decisions are pretty much out of your hands. But compare this to enacted curriculum, which is very much in your hands. Um, so, this debate I hear a lot when people talk about standardized assessment and people talking about like teaching to the test, quote unquote. Um, so even if I have an assessment that I can't do anything about, how or why does that frame my actual teaching practice? Teaching to the test and teaching like a test are two very separate ideas. So, I want you to take these two terms and separate them out and sort of recognize that you have maybe more autonomy in your classroom than you think you do. If you just view curriculum as formal curriculum, or maybe entirely possibly to see that you maybe have less autonomy than you think you do if you don't recognize the importance and significance of formal curriculum, that there are decisions that are being made that you are sort of beholden to. So I just wanted to separate these two things out. And like I said, they'll be really important for the work we're going to be doing this semester, because a large part of what we're going to be talking about is the enacted curriculum piece. What are the decisions that you want to make about how you want to teach? The final definitions here, I just want to talk very briefly about these two terms from Jerome Bruner, um, being power and economy. And I really like these terms because they give me a way to think about two important aspects of my teaching and my planning. The power of a lesson being sort of how impactful it is, how meaningful the information is, that I want to be doing something that's not a waste of everybody's time, to be blunt. I want to be delivering a lesson that students can see the significance and the importance of as the power of a lesson. But also I want to balance it out with the economy of a lesson. I don't want to take forever to deliver an important, significant message. You may be working with, 55 minutes, give or take, within a standard middle school, high school classroom period. But does that mean you should take all 55 minutes to get to that point? Can you do in 40 what you wanted to do in 55 without losing the power of the lesson? You can probably think of classes or lessons that you sat through before that were very high in power but were very low in economy. It was a really good lesson, but it didn't need to take that long. Um, if you think about anytime you've left a meeting and thought that could have been an email, that's power that's lacking in economy. This maybe could have been delivered in a better or different way. You can probably also think about lessons that are economical but like in power. It was really good. It was really efficient. We were constantly moving along. But by the time I left the room, I had totally forgotten what it was that we had done. It didn't really have an awful lot of impact. We're not even going to talk about lessons that lack in both, because that's hardly even worth discussing. But we want to try to shoot for both. We want it to be really important, really meaningful, uh, really impactful material. We want it to be something that students come away from and feel like, I'm glad I know that now, or that I've learned that, or I can do that now. But also the economy of it, that we're able to move from topic to topic and idea to idea in a way that makes sense, in a way that's respectful of people's time and work. Economical does not always mean that we move as fast as we can, because again, we want to be responding to how students think and how students learn. So this is part of the nuance of teaching, being able to recognize when to hit the gas and when to hit the brakes. So, economy can be kind of hard to judge, as can power. There's going to be lessons that we're going to write and deliver where we think this is really going to, be eye-opening to students, and they've seen it before, they've done it before, they know it before, they just don't find it very interesting. There's also going to be times where you feel like this is a thing that I just got to do, and you feel like we're just taking a box, and you go in, and for whatever reason, it rings a bell with everybody, and everyone's really on board. You're like, huh, I didn't think this was going to be as powerful, but I guess it was. So I like these two terms. I like these ideas. I also feel like Bruner is kind of a underappreciated, undermentioned figure in education. So I feel like he deserves a little bit of due. But we'll talk about the power in the economy of a lesson within our planning as we move forward. All right, so let's move on to motivating why we should plan at all. So I give this a lot of thought, and everything I could think of really kind of boiled down to one of four things. So I want to take a second to look at these four things and just talk about them in a little bit of detail. The first of which is that it helps your students. Uh, this should always be number one in any sort of decision that we make in our classroom. Uh, and it's a cliche. It's a thing that I think we know instinctively to say that if it's good for our students, it's good for our classroom. But how does that always reflect in what it is that we do in our classroom? Is it really always obvious in what we do? And as sort of a side note to that, I mean, I would really kind of caution, how much we allow our ego as teachers to be brought into a classroom. We can say it's really about our students, but there are times where we may slip and make it about us, and make it about us as the teachers, um, our own ego, our own sense of importance. Um, I don't really need to make my students feel as though I am the expert. That should be an assumption. That's why I'm teaching the class. So it was a very liberating thing for me to sort of recognize how little uh, I am important to my own classroom. I already know the stuff. I'm already the teacher. I'm already the expert, whatever that means. So really, I'm really not that important in the grand scheme of things. Clearly, I'm important because I'm kind of like helping direct the way things are going. But the actual process itself, a lot less of me and a lot more of my students is usually a really good thing. So making the students really the central focus of things, is it's you're hardly going to go wrong with that. So the first thing, good planning is going to make your students learning a lot more efficient, a lot more focused. It's just going to be a better experience for your students, and that should always be paramount. The second thing is that it helps your classroom environment. Uh, the more focused and the more your students are working, the less time they're going to have to do silly things and get themselves in trouble. It's not about keeping them busy, it's about keeping them active, and there's a huge difference between the two. Uh, the better I plan, then the less time I have moving slowly from one thing to another. The less time I have to be standing in front of a classroom going, let's see, let's do, no, let's do this. Those transitional moments, the more I elongate those and the more frequently I have those, and the more uncertain they are, the more I sort of invite problems within my classroom. So we'll talk a lot more about classroom management later on, and sort of formalize the way we want our classrooms to work and how we want to visualize what our classrooms are going to go. But effectively, students should be doing something, and the more that I sort of like turn students loose to just kind of do whatever they want, like I said, that's when bad decisions, that's when bad choices get made sometimes. The third part is professional development. Um, when you're student teaching, you're gonna have a lot of eyeballs on your teaching. You're gonna have a lot of people that are gonna be there to help you and to say this was good, this was good, this could be better. When you get your own classroom, it's gonna be hard to find people who are gonna be like actively mentoring you and watching you teach as much as you will have when you're student teaching. So a lot of your professional development is going to come from your own reflection and your own introspection. a large part of that is going to come from your lesson planning. When you get done with the lesson plan, to go back and look at what you've written and really honestly consider what it is that you've done, and make a note, make a record of what worked and what didn't work, and really be able to assess your own teaching honestly and objectively. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do. If you're not doing that, then you're just stagnating as a teacher. You're just going to be at the same spot, until you retire or quit or get fired or whatever. So this provides a record. This provides, uh, you know, a benchmark of where you are or what you're trying to do, and what you accomplished that you wanted to accomplish, and then what you didn't accomplish, or what you thought you were going to, but you accomplished differently. So it's sort of a scorecard in a way to measure yourself and give yourself ideas of how to improve. So the professional development piece is really big. And the last one is probably not a reason that we want to think about or talk about it, but it's a very important one, and that it's just a professional expectation. Um, if I'm supervising your student teaching, if I see that you don't have lesson plans, that's not going to work out very well. My first year of teaching, I had to submit by Friday all of my lesson plans for the next week. It was not a punishment necessarily. It was expected of all first year teachers. It was expected of, I believe, all probationary teachers at that school, just so the administration could make sure that we were sufficiently planning our material. I don't know if anybody ever read them. I don't know if anybody ever looked at them, or if my chair or if my principal or anybody else ever looked at them, but it was an expectation. So it's not very esoteric. It's not very intrinsic, but I mean, it was a thing I had to do. So just sort of keep in mind, um, for now in this class, during student teaching, during your probationary years of teaching, there is a large extrinsic motivator here to lesson planning, and that's that there is going to be somebody saying, "Where's your lesson plan?" So it's probably not a very happy reason, but it's a reason nonetheless. So just be aware that that's going to be an expectation. So I saw this also, what makes up good teaching, and I think we can draw a line from what makes good teaching all the way to what makes good planning. So there's a lot of parallels between these two ideas, and so from this work, this Branson, Darling, Hammond, and LePage, that good teaching often lies at the intersection of knowledge of your learners, knowledge of your subject matter, and knowledge about your teaching. Uh, I think for most of us, we do one of those three things really, really well, another one of those three kind of well, and then the other one we may not consider very much at all. And I'll be completely honest, when I first started teaching, I put subject matter at the very top. That was the thing that I knew. I knew my math really, really well. And so that was the thing that I really knew how to do. Um, the learners was probably second. I got to know some of my students. Uh, the other students maybe I didn't get to know as well. Maybe I didn't see them as having as much in common with me. So I would connect with some students, but maybe not others, and sort of like even if I connected with them, it was maybe not always in a pedagogical sense. I knew what TV shows they watch or sports they were interested in, but maybe I didn't always translate that into understanding what their learning style was or what their learning needs were. And then at the bottom, absolutely would have been knowledge about my own teaching. Um, when I first started teaching, I just approached every single lesson pretty much the same way. It was very cookie cutter, and I taught the same way pretty much every single day. And so I didn't really respond to what students need, and I also didn't respond very well to what my strengths or weaknesses were as a teacher. Um, I've since obviously grown out of that, and learned to appreciate all three of these things are very, very important. I need to know my students, and I also need to know my teaching. Subject matter still good, big thumbs up there. But the actual like practice of teaching part, the pedagogy part, was severely lacking in my teaching, and I saw that being reflected in my students' performance. So these three things I think are all crucially important. So take a really brutally honest self inventory, like where are your strengths and where are your weaknesses, and obviously work toward your strengths because those are good, but also work toward improving those weaker areas of your teaching or those things. And then also, if you know that something is a weakness, then plan for that heavily. If it's something that you don't naturally do as well, then really factor that into your lesson planning. Um, if you know you're going to do it instinctively, then you probably don't need to plan for that as much because that's a thing that you're going to do. I would still plan it, so I'm saying just not as much. But the areas in which um, that you need some work. So for me, planning around improving my teaching methodology was crucial because I knew that was the piece that really needed to improve. That was the lower of the three. So how could I involve new ideas and new approaches into my teaching? How could I diversify my teaching, add more tools to the toolbox, so to speak? So once you're honest about the areas in which you need to grow, then you can focus on those within your planning. And then when they're focused in your planning, they'll become focused in your teaching because hopefully your teaching is going to be drawn from your planning. Also, I want to talk very briefly about the stages of teacher development. Um, there is kind of three main stages, which I know don't really match with the graphic, but I thought the graphic was really interesting. So we have this first idea of survival, which kind of relates, I think, mostly to like this first stage of the novice. Unconscious, incompetent, which is a pretty harsh way to put that. But it's to a large extent, that's what it is. I have no idea what I'm doing, and what I do, I don't do very well. And that's the reality for I think most teachers. It's just where you are. Um, it's a fun career. It's a fun the job to do, but there's so many things to do, and I don't always know how much those things can be taught in a class. To a large extent, you got to get out and kind of trial and error it. You need classes like this, so you have and teacher programs like this, so at least you have a way to think about how to be prepared, and then you kind of go out and realize like I'm woefully unprepared to some extent. It is part of it, and every teacher really goes through it to some extent or another. It may not be an ongoing feeling. It may be just a situational feeling, but there's definitely going to be times where you just kind of feel overwhelmed, and that's part of it. And so it's just surviving that sense of being overwhelmed and getting through that novice stage. How long is that going to last? A couple of years, at least. I would say it took me probably 4 years maybe until I really felt like I was doing something beyond surviving. Um, so yeah, and obviously there's a gradient to that. When my very first day, I was in 100% survival mode. And by year 3 or 4, I was probably maybe around 40, 45, 50% survival mode. But I was still, pretty strongly in survival mode. Beyond that, we get into this idea of situational teaching, and I think of that more as like these middle two stages here of apprentice and journeyman. Um, Conscious and competent, at least being aware of what I'm doing, but just not being able to do it very well, and then conscious competent. And I think this is the interesting one here in contrast with the last one. Conscious competent being that I can really do a good job, but I got to really be thinking about what I'm doing as I'm doing it. It does not come natural to me yet. It is not instinctive yet, but at least I'm doing a good job. At least I'm, out of the incompetent stage. And um, that, obviously these stages again all take a while. You're not going to progress through these, 1 month, 2 months, whatever. These take years. I would say that for that apprentice stage for me was probably a good 2 years or so, and then moved into journeyman. But my teaching career took a lot of twists and turns along the way, which factors into that. But this idea of the journeyman, like being able to do the job, but having to really think about doing it. And then the last stage, this mastery and expertise, the master being unconscious and competent, not literally unconscious, because that would be terrible, but that I'm able to do a really good job without maybe thinking about it quite so much. It does become instinctive. It does become second nature. I just sort of know how to do that thing. Um, And that's sort of nirvana. I would argue to a certain extent, I don't know how much I'm at that point yet. Um, I, 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 I still really try to think and focus about the job that I'm doing. So maybe I could operate on that level now after, all these years of teaching, but I prefer to be the journeyman maybe. Maybe I like being conscious because then I'm more aware of what it is that I'm doing. So I don't know. It's a framework. It's a way to think about it. I'm not, it's not the end all be all, but just something to be thinking about. The larger point for where a lot of you are right now, you're just in survival, and that's okay. Don't feel like you're somehow wrong for being where you are. Everyone else is there. Is there also? You're not maybe all in the same boat, but you're all in the same ocean right now, and that's okay. That's part of it. It's a very natural stage of teacher development. These next two should be very familiar. I just want to talk about two kind of theoretical frameworks, and they're both going to be really important for the lesson planning that we're going to be doing. We're going to come back to these ideas quite a bit, and these should be very, very familiar. These should be old friends. So we have this idea of Gardner's multiple intelligences, and I know this has progressed over the years. There have been new intelligences added into the multiple intelligences over time. But this graphic kind of shows the basic idea of what's going on with Gardner's theory, that we all sort of learn in different ways. Now, don't take this idea too literally to say like I only learn as this, or I only do that, or I can't do that at all. These are all preferential. These are ways just in which I feel more comfortable. Um, I don't always, as a student, feel very comfortable with the interpersonal uh, intelligence, and yet professionally, that's what I do. That's a large part of what being a professor is. So it's not that I can't do it. Just as a learner, that's a thing that maybe I kind of like shy away from, or I prefer kind of like not to do. But it doesn't mean that I can't do it. So you know, we will talk about this in terms of our teaching as almost like a checklist to make sure that we're reaching all of our students. As a math teacher, I exist a lot in that logical reasoning domain. It's easy to teach a math classroom like a mathematician, and it's a very natural thing to do. But how are the other aspects that I can bring into my classroom? How can I make my math classroom involve more kinesthetic styles of learning? How can I get students up out of their seats and doing things and physically experiencing mathematics? Like, that's a big question. That's a super big question. If I can't ever do that, then the students who prefer that will feel underserved in my classroom. So I need to find ways of doing that. Linguistic, it's easy to think of that as strictly being the domain of an ELA classroom or a social studies classroom, that's where discourse happens most often. And yet there are ways certainly of bringing discourse into a science classroom. How do we get students to talk about how they understand chemistry or biology or physics? So there are still ways in which to do this. We can't do all of these every single day. That's ridiculous. But if you can't think of the last time you've done one of these in your classroom, then it's probably been too long. And so be thinking about and looking at ways in which to incorporate these ideas into your classroom. This is the last one. This is a big one, and we will come back and spend a lot of time on Bloom's in the next lesson, the next video on objective writing. And this is good old Bloom's taxonomy. And again, just like Gardner's, I know this has undergone some revisions, and so depending on which sort of generation of Blooms you find, um, the layers may have different names, but this is largely the same idea. Whether we call this knowledge or facts or factual knowledge or whatever we want to call it, it's all sort of the same idea that we have very concrete learning at the bottom, moving up into more and more abstract ways of thinking. At the very beginning, I just got to have facts. I got to have terms. I have to have, relatively objective pieces of information that I can do things with. And then as I start to move up into, application and analysis, those first two levels of knowledge and comprehension are typically referred to as the lower levels of Bloom. And then those top four we start getting into much more abstract ideas. Once I start looking at the application and analysis of ideas, I got to be able to use those facts pretty flexibly and use them in very creative and malleable ways. So it becomes much more and more abstract. Um, we'll talk more about this idea in class, so I want to make sure that everyone's very comfortable and very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy before we go on, because like I said, it is such a crucial part for me of how I think about good lesson planning. So uh, just wanted to put it out there again to be thinking about it, and just to let you know you're going to be hearing more about Bloom's over this course than you probably want to. But it's a pretty central idea for me. So for next time, we will start the actual practice of writing a lesson plan. We'll talk about the structure of a lesson plan, what's involved in it, what are the pieces. We'll look at each of the three main pieces sort of individually, and that'll kind of get us up to being able to actually write lesson plans. We'll define a framework. We'll look at Bloom's and sort of take a deeper dive into Bloom's and how we can use it for something. I know when I first started teaching, I heard about Bloom's taxonomy and thought that's great, but what do I do with it? We're going to talk about what we're going to do with it. That's the exact question that we're going to address. So how do we actually take this theory, this theoretical framework, and apply it to like do something with it? And then at the end of the next video, we're going to actually be writing some objectives. We're going to get started with it. So that's what we're going to be doing next time. So if you have any questions about anything from the video, please let me know. We'll talk about this, like I said, in class. But make notes of anything that you're not entirely sure of. Bring those to class, and we'll get those questions answered. Thanks.